The year is AD 33, and Jesus Christ is dead, and his disciples panicked. 3 days later, Jesus Christ stopped being dead, and his disciples panicked. 40 days after that, Christ ascended into heaven, and at this point his disciples were used to his shenanigans. But this left the question, what now? They had just witnessed the most unbelievable thing in the world, and now they had been told to go out and make sure people believed it. The movement sparked by this, which we now know as Christianity, all agreed on what had just happened and who Jesus Christ is. But just as today with a movement that is diverse, various opinions sprang up about what had just happened meant for certain parts of the lives of the believers. And today we're talking about what's commonly called the Jewish faction of early Christianity, and what they believed about it. Right after Pentecost, the early church started evangelizing to people about what they had just experienced. And at first, the mission was only to the Jews living in Judea and the nearby diaspora. However, soon enough the followers began getting the attention of the Gentiles, non-Jews, and as they realized that a lot of their fellow countrymen, the Jews, were rejecting the Messiah Jesus, they also noticed that they received a surprising interest among these other peoples. But much like the so-called nation-state of Denmark, this caused a problem. Did these new Gentile believers in Jesus Christ have to become Jews? And if they did, what did this becoming Jewish mean after Jesus? A variety of opinions arose, distinguished by their respective attitudes to the Jewish law. And today's video will focus on one of those that we refer to as the Jewish Christians, or the Christian Jews. It should be noted that, much like the modern nation-state of Denmark, the term Jewish Christianity is a made-up category, and not strictly historical. While there definitely would have been people back then who called themselves Christian and Jew, this is not what we refer to by Jewish Christianity. St. Paul, the lead proponent of the other side, would have called himself both a Jew and a Christian most likely. Instead, we applied this term to one nuance of Christianity that took a particular side in a particular debate regarding the law. Was Christianity post-Pentecost Jewish by its very nature? As we have mentioned, the first followers of Jesus were all Jews, and for the first 2 centuries of the religion, Jews had a considerable presence in the church. But since a greater and greater part of the church soon found itself non-Jewish, should these Gentile converts have to uphold the Jewish ceremonial law, most prominently symbolized by circumcision? The Jewish Christian side are those who leaned more to the opinion that the Jewish ceremonial law was still important. But even that category is very broad. On the one hand, we had St. Peter and James who were willing to see the nuances of both sides and not force the Torah upon others, while still observing the Torah themselves. And on the other radical side, we have the Ebionites, who went completely off track and were so-called Jewish that they denied the deity and virgin birth of Christ, and put heavy emphasis on Torah observance as necessary for all his followers. And of course, they were considered heretics by everyone else. The main figure pushing Torah observance for his congregations was St. James, the brother or half-brother of Jesus Christ, and the leader or one of the leaders in the Jerusalem Mother Church. St. James was martyred in AD 62 at the hands of the Sanhedrin, assembled by the Sadducee high priest Ananus during a time where there was a lack of Roman authority in the land. The charge leveled against St. James was that he broke the Jewish Torah, and this is reported by the Jewish historian Josephus, who, in that short report, states that the most pious Jews in Jerusalem were upset about this, seeing as James was known as one who kept the law scrupulously. This is even attested of in St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, where certain people from James come to preach strict Torah observance to the Gentiles, seemingly as a matter of salvation. This was probably right before the Council of Jerusalem, which officially settled the issue. But even before this council, St. Paul testifies that his teaching about circumcision was acceptable to the leadership of the Jerusalem church. These people from the so-called circumcision party seem to have been more stringent on the law, perhaps as a matter of salvation, as Paul seems to go heavily against what they are doing, but perhaps also simply because they wanted to seem more Jewish. You see, under the Roman Empire, the Jews were given special exemptions from things like conscription and, more importantly, sacrificing to the emperor. Christians were in the beginning sort of maybe under this exemption, at least according to the Romans, but as they split more and more from the now apostate Judaism, these Jews were beginning to complain that these Christians are under our exemption, but they aren't part of us. They don't hold to some of our same rights, like circumcision. And so part of the reason might have been to try to seem more Jewish for the sake of getting along with the Jews and the Romans. But most likely it was a mix of these two reasons. On the one hand, security under the Roman law, and on the other, reverence for the Jewish Torah. We even hear how they peer pressured St. Peter, who otherwise was more on Paul's side, preaching the same thing that he was. But no matter the specifics, one thing is clear. St. James was the main figurehead among the Torah-sympathetic factions in early Christianity, even after his martyrdom, as we see in later pseudo-Clementine literature, for example. There are even nuances showing this debate within our evangelists. Mark writes how Jesus said his famous "It is not what goes into a man that defiles him, but what comes out of him," in opposition to the Jewish food laws. But Matthew, who was definitely writing to a more Jewish Christian audience, omits that this is what Jesus was speaking against. But even Matthew is in places very strict against the Jews in many places in his gospel, showing that clearly the two different factions of Christianity were just that, factions, still very much united under a common narrative. They weren't two sides completely opposing each other and making up two different movements, one Gentile and one Jewish Christianity. These are the two categories we apply to a very nuanced opinion about a certain subject in an otherwise united movement. It's for example telling how a lot of the internal fighting over theology happened over circumcision, and not over something like, say, the divinity of Jesus, which you'd think Paul would write more about if it was a contentious issue, and not something everyone had agreed upon from the start. Speaking of St. Paul, his letters are where a lot of our information about this early debate within Christianity comes from, and we see in him not only a fierce opponent of this movement, but a person at times sympathetic to it. Whereas he states in his letter to the Galatians that he wishes those who preach circumcision were themselves cut off from Christ, in Corinthians he writes, and this is soon after the Galatian letter, that he became a Jew for the Jew and lived as one under the law to win the hearts of those under the law. And a whole portion of his letter to the Romans is dedicated to making sure the primarily Gentile Church of Rome cared about the so-called weaker brethren who observe food laws and days and months, etc., and were probably Jewish. At the end of the day, this was not a big hostile conflict with people from one side refusing to call the other one a true Christian. It was a brotherly argument in a church still trying to define itself in its early days. Sometimes, yes, it led to anger and emotions, but at the end of the day, this was the church people like Tertullian looked at and said, "Behold the Christians, how they love each other." And this is what we as the church ought to strive for today. That despite our disagreements over tiny matters, we ought to still love each other, even when we have to put our foot down once in a while. So what happened to the more Torah-observing Christians? Well, it's a combination of factors ranging from historical to intellectual. As a Christian, I'd say that they lost out simply because they were in the wrong, and God preserves and guides his church into truth. The same providence that made sure Arius the Antichrist and Pelagius the Parasite lost their respective battles for the church made sure the Torah-observing Christianity eventually lost out, even though, don't get me wrong, the Torah observers were not anything like the other two. The beginning of the demise for Jewish Christianity was, same as for the remaining apostate Judaism, the destruction of the Second Temple in the Great Jewish Revolt. Not only was this a huge blow, as Jerusalem was the mother church for this faction, but the signs from God were also clear. Judgment had come on the old system, and a new one would take its place no matter what. The Jews, at the hands of the rabbis, the Pharisees, after this began taking stricter measures to define what really is Judaism, and they were very clear: Christians are not Jews, and they even began cursing Christians in their synagogues. So the split between the faithful Christians and the apostate rabbinists was finalized after the destruction of the temple. And inside the church, the Jewish Christians simply could not compete with the message of the Gentiles. Not only was the idea more popular with a far greater number of Gentiles in the empire that one needed not be circumcised to be a Christian, but the Jewish Christians also never produced a thinker and a theologian that could in any way, shape or form compete with the brilliance of St. Paul, St. Irenaeus or Tertullian, that argued that the Jewish system lived on in the church in another way than simply through ritualistic laws. Some of these Jewish Christians lived on in groups like the Nazarenes, which were an Orthodox Christian group that simply decided to follow the Torah as a matter of custom, or the Ebionites, who split themselves from the church completely. And maybe this was just coincidence, or maybe the fact of the matter really is that there was a right and a wrong side to this debate, and it's a lot easier making good arguments when you are right. Having already made my own statement on the matter, as I see it, directed by divine providence, I'll let you decide for yourself. This has been our first look into the history of Christianity and our church, and into a movement that was a natural outflow from this history, but that eventually found itself on the wrong trajectory. Perhaps something was lost as Christianity became more Hellenized and strayed further from its Jewish roots, but perhaps even more would have been lost if in this early stage, when the movement was still in the process of identifying itself, it would have gone the other way. Either way, it's important to remember that this was an argument between two brethren who loved each other. Thank you for watching, and peace be with you all. Amen.